Hello, everybody, and welcome to our presentation of our book chapter, Ethics of AI in Organizations, a Conceptual Mapping. My name is Sean Noble, and I conducted this chapter with my colleague, Dr. Veljko Dubljević. We hope you find our presentation insightful, informative, and hopefully thought-provoking. So before we get into the presentation itself, I want to go over a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to be talking about today. So first, I'm going to go through an introduction of the theoretical background behind our study, what we see as the impetus for it, and what we hope to garner from it. Then I'm going to talk about what are, as we see them, the principles of ethical AI and the categories, namely avoiding undesired results, acting responsibly, and ameliorating the lack of ethics in AI, that we categorize them into. Additionally, I'm going to cover the existing organizational theory that we draw from, that is organizational justice theory and corporate social responsibility, in order to integrate these theories with the ethical principles of AI to determine what insights we can garner and what recommendations we can make to organizations as a result. So I think what we're seeing from the conference today and the world around us is that AI, in many ways, could be a force for good, especially for organizations. New financial and human capital insights are being generated by new AI enabled processes like big data analysis, web scraping, social media analytics, gamified assessments, algorithmic screening, and chatbot technologies, to just name a few. And all these things, again, are catalyzing new methods of organizational functioning, new strategies, new operations. And in many ways, AI is here to stay. And in that way, it's a force for good. But when used improperly, as we've started to see, and I think as well we've been talking about today, it can also be a force for harm. It can encode prejudice into decision making processes used by organizations. It can violate privacy of those that are being scrutinized by AI based systems. And it can create ambiguity over the responsibility and liability of AI made decisions. For example, if an organization were to engage in discriminatory hiring as a result of an AI, would that be who would be liable? The user of the AI system or the developer? So we're seeing then that unethical AI can create many issues. And this was also emphasized in the case of Mr. Ibrahim Diallo, which was a article, a story publicized by the BBC. What the case of Mr. Diallo is that he woke up one morning and he found that he had been fired. He was contracted. He was on a contract with an organization as sort of an independent consultant. He's supposed to be working with them for a few years, and only a few months into his contract, he was notified by his recruiter that he had been fired by the organization. He went in that day asking his supervisor, "Why had I been fired?" She said that it was a mistake and that it would be fixed. And to make a long story short, over the next several days, Mr. Diallo was slowly locked out of the organization's systems one by one until eventually he was escorted off the campus grounds by security. And over the next several weeks, an investigation was launched. And while the problem was found, it turned out that a manager who was fired had failed to properly renew Mr. Diallo's uh, contract, and the automated system kicked in and took over and fired Mr. Diallo as a result. Uh, that even after those 3 weeks, it had resulted in Mr. Diallo not being able to function as part of the team. He had lost those weeks of pay. And quite frankly, Mr. Diallo, after all the ordeal he had gone through, decided he didn't want to come back to the organization. So it lost them a valuable team member and a consultant. And I think what the story of Mr. Diallo really emphasizes is that from both a moral and a practical perspective, unethical AI can be very harmful to organizations and their functioning. And so the need for ethical AI is quite evident. And we hope that our chapter serves to provide guidelines that organizations can follow to, or at least begin to follow, in order to adhere to ethical principles as they are. So what ethics is then is a set of reflected norms, rules, precepts, and principles that govern and guide the behavior of individuals and groups. So AI ethics, therefore, is the important question of what principles should govern and guide the design and use of AI-based systems. And during our research into the data, we found that between 2016 and 2019, 59 ethical AI frameworks were produced by private, academic, and government institutions. Evidently, lots of people were interested in describing what they felt were the ethical principles of AI, but 59 different frameworks for organizations or developers of AI to reference every time they want to ensure that they are conducting AI ethically, it's not going to be a very efficient or efficacious system. So a more parsimonious grouping is going to be necessary. And that's what we aim to do here. The Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University actually compiled 36 of the most eminent sets of these guidelines to condense them into 8 principles. And what makes the Berkman Klein Center report particularly useful for our purposes is that they do represent a very representative sampling of international and multi-stakeholder perspectives of what constitutes people's shared perspective of the basic tenets of ethical AI. And some of the original concern, the critique that we got in our chapter was, how do you know these are the best ethical principles? I use, sets of guidelines by this organization or this group, and those comments, the ones that we received, actually ended up being included in these 36 guidelines. Some of the, again, these are the most eminent sets, as those researchers believe, and as we believe, of the basic tenets of ethical AI as they've been created. So, but we didn't want to stop there. We also included a recent report that was conducted after the Berkman Klein Center report, but within the same year, by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And what's interesting about the UNESCO report is that it truly reiterates many of the Berkman Klein Center principles, but it adds one crucial theme, which was sustainability. And we thought that was particularly important to any set of ethical AI guidelines, that being conscientious of sustainability and AI's role in that was definitely relevant to a set of ethical principles. So we categorize these 9 principles into 3 categories, again, to give a more parsimonious representation of the principles, if you're so inclined. So the first was avoiding undesired results, which meant avoiding the dangers of AI when used for unethical or immoral purposes, whether that's intentionally or unintentionally. The second is acting responsibly, the idea that AI should be developed and utilized under appropriate scrutiny and within legal boundaries. And the third is ameliorating the lack of ethics in AI, the idea that the development and utilization of AI should include consideration of moral and ethical values. And we actually came to these categories based on a study by Auchichi et al., who found that in popular media discussions, there are 3 particularly prominent categories that they categorized discussions of ethical AI in the media as. And these were undesired results, liability, and a lack of ethics in AI. So what we did was we reframed these categories from descriptive of what was being done in the media to prescriptive in terms of what organizations should be doing. And we found there was actually a lot of overlap between the 2 frameworks, and it served quite well with the principles that were outlined by the Berkman Klein Center and by UNESCO. So to kind of summarize what they did and how they fit into our categories, you can see here in table 1, the 9 principles specifically are fairness and non-discrimination, privacy, safety and security, human control of technology, transparency and explainability, accountability, promotion of human values, professional responsibility, and sustainable development. And I'll try not to just read this slide word for word. I think a lot of these principles are self-evident. I'll pick out a few. Fairness and non-discrimination. Again, that the idea that algorithms should be non-discriminatory, fair, inclusive, representative, and free from human biases. Humans should retain control of this technology, and that means not just humans should control the AI, although that is one meaning of it, but also that it should be subject to human review and scrutiny, particularly by those impacted. Accountability, the idea that, again, there should be liability, specifically whether that's continuous assessment, evaluation, refinement of AI use, or simply the creation of new regulations and subsequent liability for failure to meet these regulations. And sustainable development is the idea that AI should benefit um, the goals of, or at least not hinder, the development of sustainable societies and objectives. And we point in particular on that principle to the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals as being one way to contextualize what sustainability means. Having identified what the principles of ethical AI are, our next step was then to identify what are the existing organizational theories that most align with these principles. And from there, not only would it justify the existence of our principled AI, but it would also suggest ways in which this principled AI could be beneficial to organizational functioning. And the theories we identified, which are organizational justice and corporate social responsibility, have been identified to be correlated with positive organizational outcomes. In particular, organizational justice is correlated with increased organizational functioning, increased employee performance, job satisfaction, and reduced turnover intentions, just to name a few. So, as much as we are able to overlap these two different theories and principles, we find solutions that are useful to organizations. But first, it's necessary to define the theories themselves. So, first, we have organizational justice, which is the perceived adherence of organizations to rules that reflect appropriateness in decision context. And the basic idea is that when an individual in any sort of organizational context, like somebody applying for a job or maybe going for a promotion or undergoing a training process, they will have perceptions of justice that are split across one of these four dimensions. And those are distributive justice, the perceived fairness of the decision outcome itself, whether or not perhaps I was able to get into the training program, whether I earned my certificate after the program, whether I was hired for the job, whether I got the promotion, et cetera, et cetera. Also involved are procedural justice, which is the fairness of the decision process itself. How fair did I feel the process was? Was it consistent? Was it job related, etc.? Informational justice, which is the degree to which honesty and truthful information is used to justify the decision. Did I feel like I received timely and accurate feedback? And did I feel like the feedback that I received was valid? And finally, interpersonal justice, which is the degree of respect and propriety of questions during the decision making process. When I interacted as a part of this process, for example, maybe I was in an interview, did I feel like I was treated with respect and honesty? And all these comprise form perceptions of organizational justice. The other theory we sourced from was corporate social responsibility, which is an organization's responsibility to act not only in the interest of its stockholders, but to all stakeholders within the organization's scope. And while the definition of corporate social responsibility can vary widely, for example, to what extent does scope extend? How far does this go? Is it just within legal boundaries or is it something more pro-social? Can vary from definition to definition. But generally speaking, the overall idea behind corporate social responsibility is that organizations have a degree of responsibility to the society at large, to their community, beyond their own immediate self-interest. And so knowing both the definition of organizational justice in procedural and distributive and procedural justice, as well as interpersonal and informational justice, as well as corporate social responsibility, we started to see when writing our chapter how these theories justified a lot of our principles and even overlapped. We identify these areas of overlap here. So when looking at distributive and procedural justice, we found that when developing AI, both our principles and these two dimensions would recommend that AI-based systems should be trained and evaluated by human stakeholders, and they should be explicitly weighted to factor not only the validity, that is, not only the predictability, we would call it criterion validity, the predictability of the algorithm, but they should also factor equity such that they encapsulate the entirety of the content domain of interest. So, for example, to put this into context, when a selection process occurs, it should consider not just the most common methods of identifying KSAOs, like maybe quantitative ability or leadership experience. And oftentimes in algorithms, they identify those that are previously identified by job incumbents in their resumes, but it should also the developer should take steps to ensure that any sort of relevant experience is captured by the algorithm, not just the most common one. When using AI-based systems, such as when organizations are utilizing them for these purposes, they should be fair and non-discriminatory. Decisions made by the systems should be reviewed by a person ultimately. Outcomes should be easily interpreted and understood such that they can the user are able to both interpret and provide feedback that is interpretable. And they should be continuously monitored and subjected to either internal or external liability. And this can be in the form of an internal monitoring group that is in-house from the organization, maybe a department that is dedicated to regulating, maybe a computer science department dedicated to regulating the algorithms, or external liability, which simply means legal liability. In this case, there should be laws advocated. We are already seeing that, for example, in New York, such that AI is subject to these regulations and an even playing field is kept between organizations. In terms of informational and interpersonal justice, informational justice, as well as our principles, suggest that when an AI-based decision is made, information used to justify the decision should be transparent and explainable. Again, we should be able to give timely and accurate feedback, and the process itself through which we do that should be transparent. And also that the results of these processes should be stored safely and securely, and they should remove any identifiable information once used. Oftentimes organizations store these data for large volumes of data for large periods of time, and that's often a legal liability, especially if you are subject to some sort of hacking, as we've seen with large organizations like Equifax, that these data can be harmful. So in de-identifying these data, if you don't plan to immediately use them, aligns with both our principles and in part the informational justice. In terms of interpersonal justice, while it is the least dimension connected here because interacting with an algorithm is not interacting with a person and thus doesn't constitute interpersonal justice in any way, shape, or form, it is still relevant because interpersonal justice, well, two reasons. One, the idea of a computer as a social agent is a contested topic in the literature. So while we want to err on the side of caution, the underlying assumption of interpersonal justice is that there must be an interaction in order to have a fair and honest interaction itself. So organizations may wish then to ensure that a human representative on behalf of the organization remains a part of the decision process. Again, thinking about human control of the algorithm ultimately. Moving on to corporate social responsibility, really any of the dimensions here could, or I'm sorry, any of the principles here could be a form of corporate social responsibility because acting ethically is acting in the interest of all stakeholders from a moral perspective. But we thought to give again a more categorical, more parsimonious answer, and we use the popular triple bottom line by Elkington as a way to do this. We identified the principles that were most aligned with each of these ideas of people, planet, and profit. So we found that one of our principles, Principle 7, suggests that AI should be used to improve well-being of all stakeholders. That's people. Planet would suggest that organizations should use AI-based systems which support sustainable goals and development. That's that sustainability principle identified in the UNESCO report. And profit is a little trickier, but still just as relevant. Accountability, that is Principle 7, will ensure that ethical AI works in support of organizational functioning rather than being a handicap. So we elaborate this more in our chapter, but the basic idea is that if organizations are all equally accountable to these ethical principles or to ethical principles in general of AI, we find that the unethical use of them won't enhance organizations unfairly. So it will enhance profit if there is a greater degree of accountability for ethical AI or for AI in general. And finally, you can see here our table summarized of these connections. We have our organizational justice theory as well as corporate social responsibility. the description of both as well as an example in practice, and finally, which principles connect most readily to each. And that is our presentation. I hope that you learned something. I hope to hear provocative questions from each of you. And yeah, have a great day.